Welcome to Unite Now, conversations at the intersection of leadership and flourishing. The last couple months of this year, we have been doing a deeper dive into concrete topics around flourishing in community. January, we talked about housing, and February, we talked about healthcare. Today and this month, we are talking about education and the vital role that education plays in people flourishing in a community. With us today, we have some just incredible experts and thought leaders and researchers when it comes to education and its impacts on flourishing in families and for individuals. So we have Dr. Dana Rickman. She is the president of the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. And we have Dr. Robert Gaines. He is the director for external affairs. And we're just really excited to have you both with us today. So thank you for coming and having the conversation with us. And of course, we have Yvette Broughton also, just one of our partners in action here at Unite. And so we just wanted to dive in. If you maybe let's start with Dana. Dana, if you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what makes you excited or what gets you passionate about this conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ruth, for inviting us to come talk to you and your audience today. What gets me excited about talking about education, I mean, that's a whole podcast in and of itself. As you mentioned, I'm the president of the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education, and our mission and our work is what gets me excited, and it really is, to the best of our ability, making sure that all students have access, to what they need to be successful learners, and then to be successful in their chosen, career moving forward. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization, and we exist to help influence leaders at the state level, but also at the local level, and any stakeholders in education, to help them make good decisions to support our primarily our public education system. But when we, the partnership, talk about education, what we mean is from early learning, from the littlest of littles, all the way through post-secondary completion, and even adult learners. As the world is changing so fast, so most of us have to reskill and upskill at an alarming rate to even keep the jobs that we have, or think about mid-career transitions. And so I truly believe that education is really the core for a good functioning society, no matter how you look at it. Like, you've got to have a strong education system to have informed citizenry and just have a better life experience. The way we come at it from the partnership, a little background about us for your core audience. We are celebrating our 30th anniversary this year as an organization. We were founded back in 1992 by a partnership between the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia Economic Developers Association. And 30 years ago, it was felt, and frankly, not a lot has changed much, that the leaders of the business community in Georgia didn't feel the public education system, primarily at that time K-12, was really producing a high enough quality workforce from which they could draw their employees and future employees. But the business leaders in the state did not know how to engage in that discussion, how to partner with schools, how to advocate for change, any of that. And so we were created to be that link, to be that advocacy voice between business and public education. And so over the past 30 years, I think our scope, I know our scope has really expanded from, as I mentioned, it's not just K-12, early learning all the way through post-secondary and adult education. And so I like to lay that groundwork for people to understand that, there are many reasons for a high quality public education system, but from the partnership, for our mission and our work, really has that workforce development lens, and it's like a strong workforce pipeline. And we come at these discussions thinking that, education is actually, it's an economic development tool. And so when you think about economic opportunities, social mobility of individual people, but also economic viability of towns, regions, states, like, how does the education system play that pivotal role? And those are the conversations that get me excited and passionate about making sure that, every citizen of Georgia has that opportunity, because we've got a pretty robust economy in Georgia. Despite the fires that have been over the past 18 months or so, the economy is coming back. So how can we make sure that all Georgians participate in that growing economy? That's some where my passion lies.
That's exciting. Man, I'm excited to dive in more. Before we do that, Robert, can you introduce yourself? Tell us what excites you about this conversation, or what keeps you up at night as you're thinking about these things?
Yeah, sure. Dr. Robert Gaines, as you mentioned, Director of External Affairs here at the partnership. I've been here about 4 years and love every minute of my job. I have a great boss, a great team that I work with, and I think being a part of a team that's invested in education in Georgia fuels my passion for the work. I've been in education for, I guess, 11 years now, and I think what really gets me up in the morning, what excites me, is knowing that there's something that happens in the educational experience with when you see a student just kind of have a revelation or a light bulb goes off that they can do something that they didn't think they could do before, right? And if you translate that into the entire P to 16 space that we operate in, knowing that there are children whose dreams and aspirations start to come to life during their educational experience, and you can be a part of supporting that, creating the next crop of doctors and lawyers and teachers and legislators and the leaders of our future are in our schools right now in this very moment, learning about something. And to the extent that our work supports that and advocates for good policy and good decision making on the part of those who are in a position to do that, that's a privilege. I don't. There are hard days in the nonprofit space, and it ebbs and flows when you're feeling like you're really making a difference. But when we take a step back and look at the 30 years we've been doing what we do, and I've been a part of that for 4, it's exciting knowing that we've had longevity and we're still making a difference. So, in a nutshell, that's what excites me, just knowing that every single day our work is inching us toward, I think, what our ultimate goal is, and that's to have every student plugged into some high quality educational experience that'll support whatever their dreams and aspirations are.
I was noticing, Dana, when you were kind of talking at the beginning, you mentioned all students and every student a couple times. It seemed like there was some emphasis that you were putting on that sense of making sure that I think, I can't remember exactly how you said it. I think it was sort of like that all students have the tools that they need to succeed or something to that degree. So I'd love to have you talk more about sort of why the emphasis on that, and where do you see the challenges around that not happening?
Well, you're a very good listener, and so props for that. But yeah, it's I don't want to say it's a code word, but it is foundational to the partnership. When we talk about all students, what we really mean is equity of opportunity for all students. I think the facts sort of bear out that if you look at education data, people talk about achievement gaps, right? And they break out data by test scores, and you see it by race and by income, and they call these things achievement gaps. It's my firm belief that we don't actually have an achievement gap problem in Georgia, or frankly anywhere. I think these are driven by what we call opportunity gaps, and we see in the research that the so-called achievement gaps really go away if we look at research and data that if a child is reading on grade level by 3rd grade, regardless of their race, their income, their English language learning status, any of these other sort of subgroup qualifiers, if they're reading on grade level by 3rd grade, they are graduating high school on time at the same rate as any other white, black, low income, subcategory. So there's not an achievement gap in terms of if students are given the resources and the opportunities equitably, like they have what they need to read by third grade, the rest, the gaps are going to take care of themselves. And so the real question for us is really looking at what are some of the systems in place from an education system, but also workforce development opportunity system, to make sure that a low income student in rural Georgia has the same resources and opportunities that according to their need that maybe an upper income student in metro Atlanta who is gifted and talented also receives the resources and support that they need to succeed. And so it's a big deal for us to really push at what we call this equity of opportunity, to make sure all students, no matter where they are in life, no matter what their life circumstances are, have the resources to meet what their needs are, and then to help them, move forward.
What are some of the key factors that you have found influence the equity of opportunity?
A lot of it has to do with, as we said, like the dispersion of resources. And some of the structural things that we have going on. And so some of it, like in school systems, you'll see, and this is not to demonize school systems, but think about like most often in the way things are structured, your brand new teachers are going to be highly concentrated in what we think of hard to staff schools, right? The schools with high percentages of poverty, high minority students. On average, their teacher tenure is a lot shorter. You have significantly more what we call out of field teachers. So teachers teaching subjects that they are not certified to teach in. You have a lot more vacancies, a lot more turnover in principalships, things like that in low income or high minority population schools. Also, resource of opportunity, things like access to AB and IP classes, our advanced placement classes. One of the examples is there's a well-known school in Metro Atlanta, and Robert can correct me if I get this wrong. There are graduation requirements of X number of years of math to graduate high school, to get your high school diploma. But if you want to go to like Georgia Tech, for example, just meeting the basic math graduation requirements does not match the entry level requirements for Georgia Tech. And so for Georgia Tech, you have to have X number of upper level math courses to even be considered to be entered. We have high schools across Georgia that don't even offer those math courses. And so no matter how smart or motivated a kid is, if they don't even have access to AB calculus, which is a prerequisite to even apply to Georgia Tech, that is not an equal opportunity for success. Those kinds of things that we talk about. And in terms of, thinking about more of a community level, opportunities for success, it's something as basic as, your local health department, for example. We run into this, especially in rural areas where staffing is an issue. All kids have to be immunized before they enter kindergarten and have like their basic, eyes checked, ears checked, signed off by the pediatrician, get your immunization, get that form completed before they can enter kindergarten. With different, how easily accessible is it for low-income families who are working a couple of jobs if the local health department is not open regular hours for them to get the kid to even get the health check to get them enrolled in kindergarten? Those are access barriers that are not equally distributed and are based on anything other than resource availability. So those kinds of things we talk about in terms of barriers and resources that need to be addressed.
I'd like to know, even from like maybe even Robert, I guess from like a policy standpoint, like what are you doing currently just to mitigate that? What is sort of the process to kind of stand in that gap and do that work?
Sure. So, one of the first examples Dana mentioned is teacher quality, right? And so, what does it look like? Well, we know what it looks like when you don't have equal distribution of quality teachers. So, one of the things we've been advocating for a long time, actually, I've come to learn, but particularly recently, is rethinking the teaching profession from the perspective of the front end of the pipeline, right? Which is where you get people into the profession, but also retaining people so that they don't quit or retire early. So we've been advocating for stronger policies that support the teacher pipeline so that, first of all, people are attracted to the profession. If you're having a hard time making a particular profession attractive to younger folks who are coming out of high school or coming out of college, you've got a major mathematical issue on the front end of that pipeline, right? You don't have enough people coming into it to even develop and to sustain your workforce. And on the back end, if the conditions are not such that people feel like they're valued or that they're being developed in a direction that's consistent with where they want to go, they may find employment elsewhere. So we're really encouraging lawmakers and even districts that have the capacity to figure out a way to invest in the teachers they have, really think about how to make teaching in their districts and their communities more attractive. Because if you're able to do that, I think you're making a step in the right direction around at least kind of plugging the holes. Right now, there are leaks, so to speak, everywhere in the pipeline. And if you're not able to address the recruitment and the retention, at some point you're just going to run out of people who can be in the classrooms, which we just noted disproportionately affects those students who are in schools that have high poverty rates, which oftentimes correlates to high minority schools. So for us, it's as simple as not as simple because it's not simple. As a matter of fact, our most recent publication calls it the new moonshot. It's complicated. We recognize that it's probably not equal to getting to the moon, but for the sake of creating an analogous image, right, of what is the scope of what we're trying to accomplish, getting the teaching profession back to a place of respectability in the public domain and creating the proper conditions for people to want to be in it and stay in it for 20 or 30 years. It's a policy issue on one hand, and I also think there's a marketing and communications issue on the other side, where if we're able to say to a 17-year-old or 18-year-old student, teaching actually is a great career. And if you can persuade those students to go into teaching, I think you've got a much better shot of getting the profession where you want it to be. Dana and I were talking a couple of days ago about a survey that came out of the DOE, the Department of Education, a few years ago that was administered by the superintendent. And it asked current teachers several questions, but one of the ones that stands out is, would you encourage your current students to go into teaching? And I think overwhelmingly the response was no. That tells you a lot, right? If even a teacher wouldn't encourage his or her students to follow in their footsteps, we've got a major problem that will be solved by way of state level policy, but also local policies that incentivize teaching, encourage teachers to stay, but those who are considering it to come in. And I also think one of the things that we've recognized is creating more pathways into the profession is a smart strategy. So if you have to go through the traditional certification process, that's very limiting to the pool of folks who are going to be able to step into a classroom with certification and teach. We've got other programs in Georgia, but I think being more creative and innovative about how we bring people in will also address that issue. So Dana may have a couple of additional thoughts, but that's just an example of, I think, how we're doing what we're supposed to be doing as an advocacy organization without stepping into the arena of lobbying all the way, but still clearly having a voice in the discussion about what we think is a good research-based path forward.
Another real sort of a practical example, there is a piece of legislation now that's being considered around dual enrollment, which is a really successful, I think, good program that Georgia has that allows high school students to gain college credit sort of at the same time. But one of the concerns the advocacy community has had is, again, to this, equity of opportunity. Like, who is able to participate and gain the benefits of a dual enrollment program? Because typically if the high school student is taking college classes or at the local technical college, a lot of these classes are at night. or during off hours. The way college classes are, different than high school classes, and so there's issues around transportation and access and things like that. And so, how do we make sure that all students, regardless of their circumstances, have access to these classes? Well, we don't know right now, but there is some legislation moving through the General Assembly right now that would really require the, I think, Professional Standards Commission to sort of publish data on the students by income, by geography, by gender, by race, so we can understand, are rural students able to gain access to these classes, or do they have to drive an hour to their local technical college? Are low-income students able to have access? Because low-income students are more likely to be working, a job outside of their high school time, and so things like that, to make sure that that we have equal access to these types of opportunities. And so I think that would be a really great. It's not a burdensome thing. It doesn't redistribute anything. It's just looking at who has access and making sure that it is equitable across everybody.
Thank you so much for sharing. I just started watching Abbott Elementary, which is like this new television show, and it just seems to be all the rage. And I have friends that are in education, and you guys talked about some of these rural areas. Like, I grew up in the rural South part of my life, so I'm just well aware of it. There are some really key differences way out there in the country, right? So another thing that you guys mentioned was just what you are. I mean, partnership is in your name. Collaboration is a big part of what you do. So I'm curious to know, how do you collaborate, and what have some of those collaborations yielded? A big part of Unite is, we believe that collaboration is a big key to flourishing. So what are some ways in which you have experienced collaboration as a positive, or maybe even some challenges in doing that to kind of pursue your goal?
Well, you're right. Partnership is our middle name, and honestly, everything we do is part of some sort of collaboration, because we're only a staff of 6. So if it was just the 6 of us trying to move this mountain, we wouldn't be able to get anything done. But we have a couple of real good examples of collaboration. I mean, one of the things I think that is sort of our bread and butter is collaborating, like bringing the folks together to solve these problems. And we do a lot of regional engagement work, like working with communities on the ground across the state. And one of the things I'm really proud of the past couple of years, Meryl Kemp Wilcox, who's on our staff, she has what we call the Rural Learning Network. And so she brings together rural leaders from across the state, not just education leaders, but thinking about community engagement and community revitalization. So obviously the educators are there, but the local business leaders, local philanthropic advocacy leaders, within different communities, health are all there to really think about how can they shore up and strengthen their own sort of what we call the birth to work pipeline. And so she convenes that group together, and they, talk about different issues. And really, it's just a space where folks can come together and oftentimes meet each other for the first time, even though they're from, a lot of times, the same community, but they have operated in different spaces, like the faith community over here, and the healthcare community over here, and the business community over here. But one, just setting the table to create space for people to view what they're seeing the problem is, and to really help elevate and really understand, okay, what's the root cause of some of the issues that we're having, and how can we collaborate together to solve some of these problems. So a lot of like sharing of practices and things. But one of the things that has just recently come out of that, her network down in, I think, southwest Georgia, southern Georgia area, that there has been a real crisis in the foster care system, which is probably true statewide, but it was particularly acute down in this particular region of Georgia, and it was hitting and affecting the education system, the housing, the people from housing, and they each had a little sliver of it. And so out of those conversations, a subgroup from this area has now come together and formed their own sort of thinking collaborative around, specifically around collectively what can they do about the father, because they each brought a different perspective and a different piece to the problem. And so once they actually started talking to each other, they were able to sort of, now that they're working on their own advocacy just around foster care in that area. So we saw that sort of spring out, and they're off, doing their own thing. And so I think part of this success is making sure you have multiple voices at the table from multiple perspectives, both in terms of sector, but ideology, background, perspective, age, all of the sort of things, and really keeping a sort of a common vision of what it is as a group you want to get out of it. And then all of our state level policy advocacy work is in coalition with other advocates, and we try to cast as wide a net as humanly possible, so that we are speaking to sort of a greater good, if you will. I know, Robert, you probably have a better, you're our external communications guy. You could probably articulate that better.
No, you hit on the two I was going to mention, which were the Rural Learning Networks and EdQuest Coalition, knowing that the fruit that we've seen from the RLN, particularly in the way of the foster care initiative, is something exciting for us. I mean, you build these partnerships and you create the conditions for these types of things to emerge. And that's exactly what happened. And that was encouraging for us because we know that we bring value to the table, but you want to see that value bear some real fruit. So the people who are investing their time in you and whatever you're doing see the benefit. And the EdQuest Coalition is a really impressive collection of advocacy organizations and education stakeholders, and the policy agenda that work is intended to advance couldn't be really pushed down the road without the number of people who are behind it. So to Dana's point, as a really small staff, we have big ideas that need a lot more people than we currently have in our office to make it happen. So it's one of our key elements, really, building those coalitions.
One of the things that you guys mentioned was the foster care initiative, and I'm thinking about, I don't know how often people would think of a foster care initiative as partnering or pairing with education. And so it's just striking to me how there are so many other factors that might impact educational access, educational equity. And I was even noticing, initially you said you were originally like K through 12, and now you're talking about birth to work. And again, I don't know how much we often think about like birth to kindergarten. Why is that important? And so curious if you guys could speak to that a little bit.
Oh my gosh, Ruth, you have another 3 hours as to why that would be important. The birth decay is, I cannot overstate its importance in terms of building a foundation for future learning, for future everything. What we know now, the general public, writ large, know now the science of it, about how the brain creates all the little neurons and all the elasticity of the brain, and all of these things. Like those, especially the 0 to 3 years, really set you up on a path on your life that can obviously be adjusted as you go, but they really are. You think about a house, like if the foundation is solid, it's relatively easy to fix the roof as it leaks, and you can fix things as you go. But if your foundation is not solid, that's a whole nother ball game to fix that house. And so the foundational work that goes into the brain development, and we even know things like the impact of good nutrition on the developing brains can really set up a child's ability to learn, behavioral self-regulation, all of these things. And that's just getting good nutrition from 0 to 3. We talk about the language environment and the developing of language skills and literacy skills, those foundational things that many behavioral problems that we see in elementary school could be completely gotten rid of, or just not happen if they had good foundational skills early on. A lot of those language delays and whatnot lead to behavioral problems that lead to all these other knock-on things, suspensions, and you start going down a bad path. And so quality early learning just changes the trajectory of a kid's life. And then thinking about that, you talk about, we really also focus on the adult population, and just some stuff is how it's all connected is that, and dads love this, but at the mother's education level, that is the strongest predictor of a child's ability to read on grade level by third grade. Right? It's the mom's education level, not the dad's. Totally off the hook here. Everything always comes back to mom. And so thinking about like the home environment, the education level of the, the primary caregiver, and how do we support adults in getting their literacy skills up. Georgia has something that's not talked about a lot, is a pretty high adult illiteracy level. And you have functional readers, but in terms of reading at beyond a 4th, 5th, 6th grade level, Georgia has a pretty high level of sort of functionally literate adults, and that impacts the next generation. We already talked about, if you can read on grade level by 3rd grade, chances are you're graduating high school on time and you're doing good. And even things like I'm looking at things like preterm births, and so prenatal care. You would think, what does prenatal care have to do with education policy? What's interesting is if you do a map overlay, 50 years ago, a lot of children that were born premature didn't survive. But there has been so much advances in medicine and whatnot that you have babies that are born 26 weeks, 28 weeks, 32 weeks that survive now. And so you look at sort of maps of the state, and so you have a lot of students. So if you're born really premature, you have a higher percentage or a higher chance of having some sort of learning disability, right? And developmental disability. And so now you have schools that have a higher percentage of students coming to them with developmental and behavioral disabilities and things simply from the fact that they were born premature. It's just how the brain works. And so have schools have that commensurate increase in capacity to deal with a higher percentage of students who are going to have developmental delays? And so if you look at things like the data that says if you're a failing school or not, which Ryan get into that right now, but if you look at sort of like a heat map of where the failing schools are, and you look at a heat map of where you have a higher than average percentage of premature births, it's almost a complete overlap. And then you have things like poverty, put on top of that. And so things like premature birth, housing policy actually has a huge impact on educational outcomes, especially for low-income families who don't have secure housing. And so you have a child that's moving a lot, looking for secure housing. Things like that all come into play when you talk about a strong educational system and the ability of the educational system to absorb those challenges and still teach those kids.
You had mentioned, do the schools have the capacity to engage and care well for kids, right? And that kind of circled back for me even to what you had said earlier, Robert, with teachers having making the profession attractive. Do they have the resources? Do they have the support they need? And I'm curious, in the school setting, whether it's resources, whether it's the incentives, have you guys found certain core things that hey, if these things were in a school, it would create an environment where the teachers felt well resourced and supported, where the school environment would be conducive to caring well for kids who are coming in and maybe struggling in some ways?
So I'm going to answer the question I'm going to answer your question in a different way, I think, than perhaps you were asking it. But what I'll say is that when you look at schools that do serve populations of students who bring those challenges, the schools that are succeeding are leveraging partnerships. So, for instance, there's a school in a metro county that has brought in Communities in Schools, which is a nonprofit organization that supports students to ensure that they graduate on time and with everything they need. And so their job is really to help students address those non-academic needs so that they can focus on their academics, because the average teacher is not equipped with the skill set of a social worker. or a psychologist or a medical professional, right? And so when we leave teachers to respond to those challenges, we overburden our teachers and we still don't really address the needs of the students because there's a mismatch in skill set versus need. So I think where you see success is for those schools that have figured out how to create sustained partnerships with entities and organizations that can actually provide those services. I don't know all the inner workings of how schools go about doing that, but I have seen firsthand an entire wing of a high school committed to those external partners. They are literally in the school. They don't come to the school at 3 o'clock. They don't, get let in the building at some point in the day. They have an office space, and they've provided washers and dryers and a clothing closet. And what they're doing is not only supporting the students, but the students' families. If you look at Marietta City Schools, for example, they have an entire center where they're addressing students' non-academic needs. And what they've seen is students have been able to shift their focus back to their academics because home is good to go. Their parents are employed, their food insecurity has been addressed, and now they can devote themselves back to their studies. Because what you'll find, and this shouldn't be a shock to anybody, but it's not necessarily the case that an underperforming student isn't up to the job. It's that they're distracted with other priorities. So you got really smart kids who are just in some complicated situations and they need some help. And so when schools are able to partner, if you think of a school in an ideal scenario as a hub of resource distribution or information, and this isn't the case for every school. I get it. There's some school districts or some parts of school districts that don't have these issues, but for a school or a school district that does have this as a overwhelming challenge, if the school can position itself at least as a hub for those community partners to come in and say, we want to set up shop so that when you do identify a student whose eyesight isn't quite up to par, we know exactly who to connect that student with. Or, oh, we learned that Johnny got put out of his apartment last night. We're going to connect that student to someone in the housing sector to ensure that he has a place to sleep at night. That certainly shores up a lot of the problems and challenges that are connected to these, what we call these social determinants, right, of student performance that aren't going to be solved by a teacher in a classroom with a textbook. So when I said I was going to answer the question, I could speak to it in a very general sense, and I know of a couple of schools that I don't want to name particularly who are doing this well, but we have seen it firsthand where they just galvanize the community. Say, we see you here doing this, we see you there doing that. Can we all kind of join forces and support the students? Because if we do that well, our community is going to be better off in the long run because we've got students with high school diplomas, with skills. They're less likely to really start dabbling in other things that in turn detract from the quality of life in the community.
How would you say, so our audience are typically people, pastors or leaders or people in churches, right? And so some of them may be teachers or principals or social workers, and some of them are not. But we're part of the purpose of the conversation is to say, how do we mobilize people, whether they're in a profession that it directly relates or not? How do we like mobilize people and invite them into an opportunity to do something about wherever things aren't working? And I'd love for you to kind of speak to that a
I
little.
think churches and congregations in particular have a really exciting and potentially powerful role that they can play. We talked about the partnership being a convener of all the different voices, right? I think churches, by nature of the fact that they have a congregation of folk that all have different jobs and backgrounds or whatever, like they're the perfect place to convene everybody together within a community. Because really, when we talk about a strong educational system, we're really talking about a vibrant community, right? And then the education system is just a piece of lending to a vibrant community. So I could see a vibrant congregation like being the place, we talk about responding to the needs of the community, like convening that community conversation about what are our strengths as a community, what are our needs, what do we want to prioritize, like where do we need to focus our efforts first, and having all the different voices. So if you have some teachers in your congregation, but you probably have some business leaders, and you probably have people from the medical profession and others, it's like, well, I think our community needs more outdoor space, or whatever, like what is the big need, and kind of do like an own sort of community needs assessment, and then think about what are the pieces that they could bring to help shore up some of those cracks. Maybe the schools, we're having a really hard time making sure all of our little kids are ready for kindergarten, and immunization's just really a problem. And maybe you happen to have somebody in your congregation who has access to the mobile unit immunization van, and so you just help. But the helping people come together and understand what their needs might be, and understand where some solutions might come in a different way, and then help facilitating those connections to solve the problems, I think could be a really powerful way for churches to engage and just kind of let the solutions bubble up from the conversations. Now, Robert, you probably have some clear thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and just the charge to the church to love our neighbors, right? And so I think, like, how do we demonstratively do that? And I think, to Dana's point, being in the community is different than being a building in the community. And so a lot of times I think churches expect the community to come to them, when in fact the charge is to go into the community. And I think building those relationships in a very sincere way, without any expectation of the people joining your church contributing to whatever ministries you're trying to build, but just simply being present and saying, we're here to serve, we're here to understand what your needs are and how we can perhaps partner with you, come alongside you, and not necessarily like fix you. And I say this as a person who's in a church. I don't say this in a outsider kind of fashion. I'm at church 2 or 3 times a week, and so I know how easy it is to think that you've got the remedy to the problem, rather than saying, I do see some challenges, but I wonder what the people in the communities that we're thinking about helping see as the problem, and how can we come alongside them. And so I think one of the very granular ways a church can be of service to a community is opening its doors and serving as a site for maybe addressing a particular need. We did an interview not too long ago with an organization. The Department of Early Care and Learning has an initiative called Happy Helpings, and it's their summer feeding program. And they're always looking for sites to set up and to feed kids in the community. It's not difficult, as far as I know, for a church to open its fellowship hall or its whatever its kind of communal spaces and say, if you guys want to come here, make sandwiches for 3 hours and distribute them. It's a great connecting point. Doesn't require a whole lot of commitment, kind of lets you get to know people in the community, and then you can kind of build from there. So I think there's some real practical opportunities for churches to look at what they have in terms of human capital in their congregation, invite those people into whatever the broader initiative is to support the community, and then create some sustainable opportunities so that the people don't feel like, oh, that was a cute 3-month project, but no, this is a part of how we're going to do church. This is a part of our charge and our call to serve the community, so that people can understand, oh, this is a part of what we're going to be doing, and I want to either commit to it or at least want to support it on the front end. And I think the community will be more responsive to the church, and it doesn't feel like this is just a 6-month thing that the church will feel good about, and now the community is back to square one because those resources were just allocated for a short-term kind of period of time.
Yeah, another example I heard of is, during this COVID time, a lot of schools, and I know my kids are little, they're in a child care center, but our child care center did it as well, from the parents that were already in the school or in the center, organized their own sort of health advisory committee, right, to help the school decide when do we open, do we want to wear masks, like all of the things. And my early learning center happens to be like down the street from CDC. So there's a ton of parents already with kids enrolled in this early learning center who are like the infectious disease people. And so we've got that resource covered. But thinking about other communities that are, a couple blocks over, like again, churches with their broad congregations, like do they have access to medical professionals who could volunteer, on a sort of health advisory board for a school to help them think through, and just thinking about the different leverage points and just the variety of folks that, come into a congregation, and leveraging the talents and then matching that with articulated needs from the community. Seems like a very sort of meshy, in a good way, those needs mesh well, and sort of helping meet where the needs are articulated.
That feels like you probably need to have a relationship with people in the
Absolutely.
community. At least I think that's what I'm hearing. Um,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
yeah, prior to, so it's, I feel like there can be sort of this impetus of like, I don't know how to get, like, what are the needs? What are the needs in our community? And I appreciate, Robert, you saying like, well, part of it is listening to the people in the community and joining. But then the next question is like, how do I listen to people in the community, right? Like, how do I do that? Um, and then that seems like that requires a relationship or inroads into relationship and even trust, right? Have you guys seen ways of engaging in community or with community partners that either help contribute to building trust and relationship, or even, I guess, undermine trust in relationship?
I mean, the approach that we use, I mentioned that we do community engagement work. Uh, we're very much research based, sort of data driven, and so we sort of wait for communities to come to us and say we would like your help. We never go where we think they need us, but they have not indicated that they think so. So there's that. So it's already an open invitation. But what we do is, again, bring together a diverse set of voices that are concerned about the future of their community. And so we try to make sure we cover, not just educators, but all the different groups. And for us, we really just sort of lead with the data. We say, here's sort of the state of your community, right? Just kind of everything from, poverty rate, but then also assets of the community. Here are things that you have. Here are some things where you struggle just from what the data says. And then give it back to them and say, what do you think? Where do you see the stress points in your community? Where would you want to start if you wanted to see a difference? What kind of difference do you want to see? What do you really want from this collaboration? And so we don't, other than, we come to them and say, we can help you strengthen your birth to work pipeline if that's what you want. That's our goal. And then they sort of lead the, what do they want to get out of it? And the community themselves, however you want to define that, sets the goal of what they want to accomplish. And then we help them, okay, well, if you want to get here, we have some ideas of how you might want to get there, but it's really they're leading the work and the conversation, and we're just providing them, almost just like resources to help them understand, where they help them, figure out tactics on how to get there. But they're the ones that decide what their goals are, and we ask, who else needs to be at the table. It's very much, we're very much a support role in taking their lead. I think, everybody knows how it doesn't work, is where trust is broken, where you come in with a predetermined idea of this is what your community needs, I'm going to give it to you. And they're like, well, that's a nice thing, but it's nowhere on our priority of what we would like. And then the worst thing, obviously, is to promise something and then just disappear and not deliver. That's pretty straightforward.
Ruth, I think an additional way for pastors and church leaders looking to connect actually is the school. One of the things I've seen work well is for the pastor or someone on the executive team to connect with a local principal and say, hey, or right up the street, we've got X amount of whatever dollars, resources, backpack, whatever it may be, and say, um, we've got some things that we were hoping to support some local schools with. Are you interested? Or just calling up and saying, do you have any needs? And what I've seen happen, particularly in Cobb County, where there are some schools that serve populations that have economic need and other types of needs, the principals are very responsive, and it creates an opportunity for deeper conversation down the line. But it's like, you're meeting an immediate need first, and then it opens up further conversations around, well, what else can we do? What else can we provide in the future? Because I think what happens sometimes is you get the book back drive, the backpack drive, excuse me, in August. But as I was telling Dana earlier, there's an entire second semester to the school year, right? So at a minimum, even if you can only commit to providing pens and paper, well, they're going to need that in January too. So that's like two touch points. But if you want to go deeper, that's a great way of saying we see you, we're present, we want to do more. But if you don't want us to do more, at least let us do this. And if the principal or whoever says, you know what, we'd like you to come in, and then maybe now you're at a PTA meeting and you're actually hearing parents talk about what they're struggling with. That's a cue for like, oh, okay, so now I'm hearing directly from not just the teachers and the principals, but from the community members themselves, because not all principals live in their community, right? You're hearing from the parents, this is what we need. And if the church is in a position to meet that need, then now you're clearly into a space that you might not have otherwise had access to. So that occurred to me as Dana was talking.
Thanks again. This conversation was just as rich and deep and substantive, or maybe even more so than I had hoped. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. And if you have been watching, thank you for joining us. And I hope that this conversation is a conversation that can get you started to thinking or lead you into down the path wherever you find yourself on that journey towards engaging community, be a helpful resource for you. Thanks again.